Yeah, I think one of the things that makes Kolchak so interesting is, especially when you look at it in that period in the early 70s, is what it's borrowing from and what it's using. So, clearly, back to Robert's point earlier, in many ways, Kolchak is a police procedural, right? It could have been any number of police procedurals if Kolchak was just a detective and those were criminals, not monsters. But, in the early 1970s, cops were not quite as popular as they had been in the 50s and 60s. And so you get a whole bunch of different kinds of detectives, women detectives and private investigators and Rockford and all kinds of things kind of started. And so Kolchak kind of takes that. And since cops can't be quite the, always heroic just because of what's going on in the news in the early 1970s, who is heroic? It's newspaper reporters. I mean, we just had the Pentagon Papers. We just had Watergate. You had Woodward and Bernstein were suddenly lauded heroes who saved democracy. And so, hey, a newspaper reporter who investigates like a cop, but then you add this gothic element and suddenly you've created something exciting and new. But absolutely, there's nothing new under the sun. The real creative part is how you kind of reformulate it and turn it into something that really feels different.
Yeah, and kudos, of course, to Jeff Rice, and I appreciate that you mentioned him in your book also. And kudos to him because his novel really predates Watergate, and the government cover up. And I always at some point, Bradley, wanted to do this because I know Jaws so well, and Kendall will bring you back if you want to do this with us. But I want to compare and contrast Jaws to the first Night Stalker movie because I think they're so similar. So similar in the struggles that Carl has that are similar to Chief Brody. And you talk about the police, procedural, and it all just sort of goes together. And I've every single time Jaws has come back on now because of July 4th and Shark Week and everything recently, man, I'm dialed in every time. I just stand there like a zombie and I just keep watching it. And the beautiful thing is my wife doesn't yell at me because she loves it too. So I can
if you can find that film, marry it. That's my thing.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see if I can play some of these from Jeff. Get this set up here.
Dr. Phillips. Hi, Robert, and hi, Dr. Phillips. I'm looking forward to reading your book. You've got a few questions. First, you said online that you have a chapter on what the series got wrong and that you're a diehard fan, but you're trying to turn a critical eye towards the movies and series. And I find that statement interesting because sometimes people find it hard to balance fondness and candor. I was just wondering, how do you push through the fan part of you to reach a place where you can look at a favorite subject with critical objectivity?
Okay, that's his first one. What do you think?
That's a great question, and it is hard. And I always say to my students, my grad students who want to do this kind of work, I said, it's very tempting to want to look at the thing you love the most, but be aware that once you start looking at it, you'll start to see past the glow and to start to see the wrinkles. For Kolchak, I think part of it was for me and probably for a lot of us, we fell in love with Kolchak when we were pretty young. I write about this in the book. I was about 9 when Kolchak was being re-aired on CBS Late Night, which I think CBS Late Night, that was a miraculous moment. I think for a lot of us, I actually started watching CBS Late Night because they were airing The Avengers, which as a 9-year-old, I thought was going to be Marvel's The Avengers. I didn't know. I started watching saying, why is this British woman in tight leather pants? And why do I like that so much? But that CBS Late Night was a bizarre, amazing, like Kolchak was there, the Rockford Files, they drop in cheap B horror movies. They had The Avengers, they had the New Avengers. Like it was just this weird place. So I fell in love with Kolchak and that time in life when it was so great and innovative. I think later coming back as a person who spent a lot of time studying the genre, now you can start to see, and I think it's like we see on a lot of the social media. I'm on the Kolchak Facebook groups, as I know a lot of your listeners are, and you guys are. You people say, wouldn't it have been great if? And that's kind of how I start those questions. And for me, probably the single biggest limitation for Kolchak was that there really wasn't what we call seriality, which is stories didn't extend. Kolchak never remembers, you know, he just faced Satan, so these witches should not be that big a deal, right? Or he just faced an alien, so the lizard creature, like, or he just faced the reconstituted 8-person creature from Antarctica. Like at some point, you would think all this knowledge would start to like accumulate, but every time he starts over, none of his colleagues ever remember. Like he's always crazy, and it's like, how am I still crazy when you saw, like, you know, you saw the vampire, you saw the weirdo guy in Seattle. Like, how can Tony keep saying, I don't believe any of this? Well, because it was so episodic. And I think most of us would agree the limitation in Kolchak was monsters never came back, the threads were never connected. And then the other part of it, that there weren't really any stakes. You know, none of the main cast was ever really endangered. Kolchak was occasionally in danger, but you knew Kolchak wasn't going to die because the episode always started with him saying, here's what happened. So I know logically he's not going to die. And in fairness, all the characters that die in the TV series in particular, who cares? Like we almost never make so there's kind of like never that development of, oh no, if Kolchak doesn't do it, Tony will die. Or there's a threat to Miss Emily. Like it's always very short and episodic, which I think as a viewer now, you kind of feel that, especially when you look at it as a whole. And I think that's also, I mean, Darren McGavin was pretty public of saying that was his frustration, was the show just kept repeating the formula. And there's only, so then you look at, and I know this is a long answer, but then you look at the shows that came after that I would say learned from that mistake. You know, Twin Peaks, at least the first season, I know Twin Peaks goes in its own special places, but Twin Peaks, you know, builds a coherent season long Who Killed Laura Palmer. The X-Files was great at balancing, here's an episodic, this is just one monster this episode, but then we're going to reconnect back to this bigger conspiracy, aliens, et cetera, et cetera. Supernatural is probably the series that deserves the most credit. I mean, my God, that was like 10 years, a massive, enormous, complicated mythology, and then it actually has an ending, which is like most series like that never actually have a moment where you're like, okay, and we're done, right? So, but all those series, I think, including Buffy, learned from Kolchak. If you're just Monster of the Week, you can't sustain the audience engagement.
Yeah, that's cool. I never got to get or find the reference of Whedon talking about Kolchak being an influence. So I'm glad that you mentioned that in your book, that has happened. And yeah, I mean, clearly there's so much about that. And I just, you know, love that not the reboot, but let's say the extended X-Files, where they bring in the character who plays the shapeshifter who plays the Kolchak character. And is that technically what he was? Skinwalker, shapeshifter? What was he, Bradley?
Yeah.
Something like that. But anyway, let's do his other one. And that was a great answer. I'm sure Jeff's going to be doing somersaults hearing you say that. Oh, try again.
Question. A tagline hints that your book discusses how Kolchak the Night Stalker both reflected contemporary horror narratives and changed them. So of all the changes it made, which do you think is the most profound? And if you just want to answer briefly and let the book elaborate on that for us when we read it, that would be fine.
So I think there are two, and the one I've already talked about, so I'll just remind us briefly, is the biggest is shifting to a narrative around the monster hunter. And that was, again, not entirely unprecedented. There had been a TV show called The Sixth Sense that had come out just a little before Kolchak, that was about a paranormal investigator. But for all kinds of reasons, that never, like, I vaguely remember it, but I think most people have no memory of that show whatsoever. Kolchak, because it was a reporter, because it was more grounded in the real world, not in paranormal investigation, I think that had the bigger impact. But the other thing, especially in terms of TV horror, especially if you look at like the way TV horror was framed prior to Kolchak, most serial TV horror, so I don't mean the anthology series, but I mean those ongoing shows, were very much domestic based, right? So Dark Shadows, the soap opera, was really built around Collinwood and the family and the household. Same are true of the kind of slightly parody shows, the Munsters, Bewitched, the Addams Family. They're all about families. And there may be families who have magical powers, or their families beset by magical things, but they're very much domestic set dramas. Kolchak took that haunted house domestic threat out into the real world. And as we we're talking about, suddenly it's not. I mean, the thing is, we never see Kolchak's house. Like, we never step foot in his house. We see him in hotel rooms. We never set foot in his house. There's never a haunted home. We almost never spend time in anybody's actual home. There's some apartments, but even when the series goes to apartments, it's usually just after someone's died and it's a brief investigation. So Kolchak takes what had long been the domestic Gothic, the haunted house, the haunted family, the threatened family, and flips that out. So now it's running amok in the streets. And that, I think, is one of the things that other series picked up on. Whether it was the X-Files or Supernatural or Buffy, it's not about a family domestic drama. It's really a much more wide-ranging narrative.
Excellent. Bradley?
Yeah, going back to something you said when you answered the first question was that Kolchak, the monster of the week, it really didn't lead itself to be, I guess, to build suspense and build to a story where I think other shows capitalized later. And I think that there's one exception where I feel like, hey, this episode really feels like there's high stakes, and that's the Horror in the Heights episode when you get to Miss Emily. And I also think, wasn't it that episode that brought back the guy who I think he found a dead body, and then Kolchak even mentions, hey, I remember you. I believe that might have been that episode. Robert, do you remember which episode was it where Kolchak references a guy and talks about him? He's like, hey, I remember, the sort of references the guy who found the body, I think, in a different, was it Spanish murders? Was it Horror in the Heights?
I do remember that happening at one point. Like, all of a sudden there was a memory. I don't remember it in that one as much as I remember it with the vampire episode. And they talk about how the vampire that Kolchak kills must be related to Skorzeny in some way or fashion from a bite.
So because ABC didn't own the rights,
they couldn't, right?
They couldn't. So
yeah,
vampire is the closest we have to a through line narrative.
Yeah,
so absolutely right. But for rights reasons, it doesn't get developed. It's the only episode where Kolchak kind of already has an idea of what to do. Like, the minute he gets there, he's like, cross, stakes, I'm ready for this. Everything else. And there, again, there are so few recurring characters. Other than the INS folks, there's Gordy the Ghoul, the autopsy guy, who I think shows up twice. And there's the police detective Mad Dog, who I think is in maybe 2 episodes as well. So again, I think that's part of, so I'm not going to say there's never stakes. I agree. The shooting of Emily, although I got to say, having watched that episode more than once, and I do, Horror in the Heights is like one of my favorite episodes. I think it's really well done. It's complicated. It's fascinating. The way it kind of mixes, like, you immediately think it's about anti-Semitism. It's Jewish. It's the swastikas. Then you mix in the Indian stuff. It's this fascinating kind of moment. But even in the end, we've known what the Rakshasa does.
Oh,
so when Miss Emily comes walking in, it's not like Jack the Ripper has Miss Emily or Tony.
True.
I always say, I tell a story in the book, so this is probably, don't need to say it here, but for me, the interesting moment that really made me think about the stakes is there's a scene in one of the episodes that's not my favorite, The Youth Killer, where Tony has got the cursed ring and he's trying to get it off, and he's got his Greek cab driver friend trying to help him get the ring off. And in the back office, he hears Tony moaning, and Tony says, Carl, come, I'm hurt, Carl, come. And I thought at that moment, oh my God, maybe Carl has the ring, or Tony has the ring. Maybe he's cursed. And so Carl goes rushing in, and Tony has been taking yoga and has got himself in a lotus position and can't get up. So it's played for laughs, like fat guy can't get up out of his lotus position. Fine, it's a funny bit. But it just, for me, it was the moment I thought, yeah, wait a minute. Updike, Emily, Tony, they're always around, they're always near, but they're never really stakes, right? It's like they're never endangered. Carl's never endangered, and all the other characters, and there's some wonderful, female characters in particular, kind of like almost his love interest or almost his partner, and then they're gone. And so that, to me, I think that's something other series learned from. Like, you have to build a world where we can care beyond just the novelty of saying, what's the monster this week?